The rain had a rhythm of its own that morning soft against the stained glass of St. Bartholomew's Chapel. The air smelled faintly of lilies and damp wool, a mingling of grief and the city's November chill. I stood at the front pew, hands folded over my clutch, offering polite nods as neighbors, old colleagues, and distant relatives murmured condolences I could barely register. Damien stood on the far side of the aisle, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit, Sienna at his arm like a porcelain figurine. They looked the part of the grieving family. But his eyes never met mine, not once. I was turning toward the altar when one of the pallbearers, a man I didn't recognize, slipped a bouquet of white lilies into my hands. His fingers lingered a moment too long, pressing something thin and firm into my palm. When I glanced down, I saw an envelope buried between the stems. I waited until no one was watching. My fingers worked carefully, sliding it free. The flap wasn't sealed. Inside, folded crisply, was a photocopy of Emilio's original will, his handwriting at the margins, the familiar signature at the bottom. It named me sole beneficiary of his personal estate and the $100 million Whitaker Trust. My breath caught the edges of the paper trembling in my hands. Before I could even take in the weight of what I was holding, I felt Damien at my side. The cologne was expensive, but sharp, almost bitter. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "Start looking for somewhere else to live," he said under his breath, his tone stripped of ceremony. Father left the house to me. I turned slowly, the will burning in my clutch like a live ember. "You seem very sure of that," I murmured. He smiled, not kindly, but with the faint curl of someone delivering news they'd been rehearsing. "Everything's already been arranged." The organ swelled behind us, the minister clearing his throat. Damien stepped away without another glance, guiding Sienna back to their seats. I watched them move together, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though the world belonged to them alone. I lowered myself onto the pew, my mind fixed not on the sermon or the prayers, but on the white envelope, now hidden beneath my coat. My fingers traced the raised seal of the lawyer's office printed on the top page. Somewhere between the hymns and the final benediction, I made a silent promise to Emilio and to myself that I would find out exactly what my son had done. 2 days after the funeral, the November wind rolled off the Charles River, rattling the bare branches that framed the Whitaker estate. I was in the study, staring at the muted gray water through the tall windows, when the sound of tires crunching over the gravel drive broke the quiet. Damien and Sienna stepped out of a black sedan, followed by a man in a pinstripe suit carrying a leather portfolio. They didn't knock. Damien opened the door as though it already belonged to him. "We'll keep this brief," he said, brushing past me toward the living room. Sienna lingered in the entryway, her eyes drifting over the crown moldings as though she were measuring them for curtains. The lawyer unfolded several pages on the coffee table. At the top, in crisp black ink, was an updated will dated just weeks before Emilio's death. In it, the estate, along with Emilio's shares in Montclair Shipping, passed entirely to Damien. My name was nowhere. I picked up the document, scanning the familiar loops of Emilio's signature. The pen strokes were shakier than I remembered. I don't recall Emilio mentioning any changes, I said evenly. Damien's jaw tightened. Things change. Father wanted the company secure, and that meant consolidating assets. As they spoke, my gaze shifted to Emilio's desk in the corner. 2 drawers sat slightly ajar, their locks splintered. The brass key Emilio had pressed into my palm the week before he died felt suddenly heavier in my coat pocket. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitaker, per this document, you are to vacate the premises within 14 days. We expect your cooperation to make this transition smooth. 14 days. The words settled over me like a shroud, but I nodded. I understand. Upstairs, I began packing my things. I moved methodically, wrapping china in newspaper folding clothes into neat stacks. On the dresser sat a photograph of Emilio and me from our first year in Boston, the river sparkling behind us. I slipped it into a box, closing the lid gently. As I taped the final carton shut, I replayed Emilio's last lucid words, the quiet urgency in his voice when he placed that key in my hand. I knew I would use it soon. 3 mornings later, I stepped out of a cab on Milk Street, the wind funneling between glass towers and snapping at my coat. The brass key in my pocket felt warm from the tight grip of my hand, though the metal was cold when I set it on the counter of Morgan & Field's private bank. The receptionist glanced at the embossed initials EW, and her expression shifted into quiet formality. "Right this way, Mrs. Whitaker." I was led through a narrow hallway lined with polished walnut into a small, windowless room. The banker, a gray-haired man with precise manners, slid the key into the final lock of a long steel drawer. With a gentle pull, he placed the safe deposit box on the table before me and stepped out, closing the door behind him. The first thing I saw was an envelope thick and sealed in Emilio's handwriting. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside, a stack of legal documents confirmed what the photocopied will from the funeral had already hinted. I was the sole trustee of a $100 million fund, entirely separate from Montclair Shipping. Underneath lay a leather-bound portfolio. I opened it to find detailed statements of offshore holdings accounts in Singapore, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands assets Emilio had kept beyond the reach of the company's board. Tucked into the back pocket was a crisp letter, only 2 sentences long. "If Damien turns, protect the legacy. Find Lucienne Hart." The ink was bold, the hand steady as if Emilio had written it, knowing I would read it in a moment like this. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of the paper grounding me. The trust was airtight, governed by terms Emilio had set years earlier. Damien couldn't touch it, not legally. Not even if he tried to challenge the will. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, placing the letter on top. The key scraped softly as I locked the box again. Outside, the city moved with its usual noise and pace, but I walked slowly, feeling each step. The cab ride back toward Back Bay was quiet, the buildings flashing past in a blur of steel and brick. Lucienne Hart. The name carried a familiarity I hadn't felt in years, a reminder of long boardroom battles Emilio had fought with a small, loyal circle at his side. When I reached my apartment, I set the letter on the kitchen counter and reached for the phone. It was time to see if Lucienne still picked up calls from an old friend. The lease was signed in less than an hour. Harlow Green, that name hadn't been on a legal document in over 4 decades, now occupied a 2-bedroom apartment on a tree-lined street in Back Bay. From the outside, it was just another brick building with wrought iron balconies. Inside, it was quiet, furnished simply and, most importantly, unconnected to the Whitaker name. I kept my phone on silent as I arranged the essentials: a desk near the window, a small safe in the hall closet, and the locked leather case holding Emilio's trust documents. From here, I could move without the constant shadow of Damien's surveillance. 2 days later, I took the Red Line to Harvard Square and walked to a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a bike shop. Lucienne Hart was already there, sitting at a corner table, the steam from his coffee curling around his glasses. "Harlow," he said, standing to greet me with the kind of formality that spoke of old loyalties. We exchanged a brief handshake before sitting. I slid Emilio's letter across the table. Lucienne read it, then removed his glasses, his jaw tightening. "He told me he was worried," Lucienne said quietly, "but I didn't realize how far things had gone. Your husband was not in his right mind when he signed the updated will. Damien made sure of it. Emilio was medicated, heavy doses, barely coherent at times." My chest tightened, though my face remained still, and Sienna Lucienne nodded grimly. She's been encouraging him to liquidate everything that isn't nailed down. That house was just the first. He leaned forward, lowering his voice further. I've heard from a contact in the financial district Damien's mortgaging company shares to fund an unregulated shipping venture in Dubai. If it fails, it won't just sink his holdings. It could drag Montclair under. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the bitterness rise on my tongue. This was no longer about hurt feelings or family politics. Damien was gambling with the very thing Emilio had spent a lifetime building. Lucienne slid me a business card. You'll need allies for this. Quiet ones. I slipped the card into my coat pocket, stood and thanked him. Outside, the wind off the Charles was sharper, but it cleared my head. I knew exactly where I needed to start looking next. The harbor was restless that morning, gray water slapping against the pilings as gulls wheeled overhead. I chose a table at the far end of the waterfront cafe where the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of tourists would swallow our conversation. Tessa Murdoch arrived 10 minutes late, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, eyes darting around before she slid into the chair opposite me. She had been Montclair Shipping's senior accountant for nearly a decade before resigning abruptly 2 months after Emilio's funeral. I wasn't sure you'd call, she said, fingers curling around her coffee. I wasn't sure you'd answer, I replied. She gave a humorless laugh, then leaned in. Damien's Dubai venture. It's not just risky, it's dirty. The shell companies he's routing funds through. They've been linked to maritime smuggling and money laundering operations in the Gulf. If this gets exposed while Montclair's name is attached, every legitimate contract could vanish overnight. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind was already racing. How much has he pulled from company accounts? Her eyes flicked toward the window. Enough that payroll was delayed twice last quarter, and he's covering the gaps with short-term loans at absurd interest rates. Meanwhile, she reached into her tote and slid a folder toward me. New cars, a penthouse in Miami, jewelry for Sienna that costs more than my annual salary. I opened the folder briefly, photos, bank statements, receipts, before tucking it into my bag. Each page was another brick in the case I was building. You're not the only one watching him, Tessa said, after a pause. Someone on the board has been feeding me scraps. I think they're loyal to you, but they're cautious. They know Damien would gut them if he suspected. That more than the numbers made me lean closer. Do they have proof? Not yet, but they have access. And they want to see you back where you belong. We agreed on a discreet line of communication. No names, no traceable devices. As Tessa stood to leave, she hesitated. Harlow. Damien's not just playing with fire. He's standing in a room full of gasoline. I watched her disappear into the crowd along the pier, the folder a solid weight in my bag. Back in my apartment that night, I began spreading the evidence across the desk, piece by piece, each page sliding into place like part of a larger map. By the time the city lights blinked on outside my window, I knew exactly how I would use it. The Ritz-Carlton's private boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cigars, the kind of place where fortunes changed hands behind closed doors. I sat at the long mahogany table with a single folder in front of me, though the real work had been done weeks earlier. Through a Bermuda holding company, 2 layers of trusts, and 1 discreet law firm, I had quietly acquired 40% of the shares in HarborLink International, Montclair Shipping's largest and most strategic partner. HarborLink handled nearly half of Montclair's long-haul cargo contracts. That made their stake in Montclair more than symbolic, it was leverage. The final signatures were inked in under 20 minutes. The lawyers shook my hand, their smiles professional but knowing. They didn't ask why I wanted such a specific block of shares, and I didn't offer an explanation. By the time I left the hotel, my control over HarborLink meant something far more valuable, indirect voting power over Montclair itself. The contracts between the two companies contained clauses tying operational decisions together. If HarborLink shifted its support, Montclair's board would feel the tremor. 2 days later, I received a call from Tessa. "Your friend on the board has made a move," she said, her voice low but tinged with satisfaction. Apparently, the loyal member still unnamed had begun sharing select financial data with a handful of investors. Not the whole picture, but enough to show Damien's erratic spending and the ballooning liabilities from his Dubai gamble. The investors weren't panicking yet, but they were asking questions. In the corporate world, that was the first sign of blood in the water. I didn't need to be in the room to imagine it. Damien brushing off concerns with that polished smile, insisting the numbers were part of a strategic growth initiative, while his eyes betrayed the flicker of unease. Meanwhile, I tightened my own circle. Every email went through an encrypted channel. Every meeting was booked under Harlow Green, Never Whitaker, and every move brought me closer to the moment when the leverage I'd built, share by share, document by document, would come into full view. Standing at my apartment window that night, the harbor lights reflected off the glass, I thought of Emilio's letter again. Protect the legacy. The words no longer felt like a warning. They were a set of instructions, and I was following them to the letter. The call for an emergency board meeting went out at dawn. By mid-morning, the Boston Globe's headline was everywhere. Montclair shipping under federal financial review. The leaked documents were precise loan agreements, inflated invoices, wire transfers routed through Dubai shell companies. It was the kind of story that didn't blow over with a press release. I arrived at Montclair's headquarters 20 minutes into the meeting. The 25th floor boardroom stretched along a wall of glass, the harbor glinting below under a thin winter sun. Inside, the tension was thick enough to taste. Damien stood at the head of the table jacket, off tie loosened, pitching a narrative about temporary liquidity challenges and emerging market expansion. Sienna's seat beside him was empty. I'd already heard she'd been spotted that morning at an exclusive spa on Newbury Street. No one noticed me at first as I stepped inside, closing the door with a quiet click. Conversations faltered. Damien froze for half a second before regaining his posture. "Mother, this is a closed session." "Then I suppose it's a good thing I hold a controlling interest in one of Montclair's primary partners," I said, sliding a folder onto the table. "Which gives me the right to be here." The legal counsel's brow furrowed as I laid out the chain HarborLink International shares my Bermuda holding company and the voting clauses in their partnership contract. The math was simple. I controlled enough influence to sway every major operational decision Montclair made. I didn't sit down. Instead, I began distributing copies of the second folder bank records, invoices, and receipts, each one a nail in the coffin. This, I said, evenly, is not strategic growth. This is reckless mismanagement and personal enrichment at the expense of shareholders and employees. The silence that followed was broken only by the shuffling of papers and the muted hum of the HVAC system. One board member, a man I recognized from Emilio's early days, cleared his throat. "We need a vote." Damien's face had gone pale beneath his practiced calm. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low. One by one, hands rose around the table. 8 votes for removal, 1 against Damien's own. The chairman recorded the decision. Effective immediately, Damien Whitaker is removed as Chief Executive Officer of Montclair Shipping. I gathered my folders, tucking them into my bag. Damien stood rigid, his fists resting on the table as though bracing for an aftershock. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance as I walked to the door. Out in the hallway, the harbor stretched wide and cold beneath the winter sky. Removing him from the company was only the first step. The rest of the legacy still had to be secured. Lucian Hart's office in Beacon Hill was lined with dark shelves and heavy drapes, the air faintly scented with old paper and cedar polish. He closed the door behind me, gesturing to the armchair opposite his desk. "It's all in front of you, Harlow," he said, sliding the trust documents across the blotter. "You tell me exactly what you want, and I'll make it unshakable." I took a deep breath, the weight of weeks of maneuvering settling on my shoulders. "Strike Damien's name completely from the Whitaker Trust," I said. "Every dollar that would have gone to him, redirect it." Lucian's pen hovered. "To where I listed them. Slowly endowments for charities, aiding widows, scholarships for children of maritime workers, pensions for Montclair's longest-serving employees. Then, almost as an afterthought, leave him $1, along with a note. Entitlement is not legacy." Lucien's mouth twitched in something between approval and pity. He began marking the revisions each stroke of his pen, severing the last of Damien's financial hold. When the documents were signed and notarized, Lucien opened a slim laptop. "Before you go, there's something else you should see. A colleague in international banking flagged this for me." He turned the screen toward me. It was an account in Monaco registered under an alias, but the transactions were familiar transfers from Montclair's corporate accounts during Damien's tenure, routed through layers of intermediaries. The total was staggering enough to fund a fleet. The anger that rose in me was sharp but cold. "Send it to the federal investigators," I said. "Today." By the end of the week, the file was in their hands. Months passed. The winter thawed into spring, and with it came news Damien had been indicted for embezzlement and wire fraud. He was released on bail, his passport surrendered. One morning in May, an envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Mother," it began, "I won't ask for your forgiveness. You were right about me. I need to leave, start over somewhere far from the Whitaker name. I hope someday I'll be someone you can meet again without shame." There was no return address. In June, I stood in the great hall of the former Whitaker estate, now the headquarters of the Whitaker Foundation. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching on the polished brass plaques bearing the names of scholarship recipients and grant partners. People moved through the space, students retired, dock workers, widows from the harbor district, talking, laughing, finding their places in a home that was no longer mine, yet more alive than it had ever been. I rested a hand on the railing of the grand staircase, feeling the hum of voices below. Sometimes I thought the greatest inheritance you can give is the chance for someone to find themselves without you.